Hello, this lecture begins a series that looks at Descartes' third meditation, in which he proves the existence of God, but more importantly, establishes what he thinks to be the foundation of the sciences. Briefly recall that in the previous meditation, Descartes had found something that could be believed with 100% rational certainty, and this is his own existence as a thinking thing. So Descartes has found something that is certain, but it's not quite enough to be a foundation for the sciences. It's not clear how knowing that oneself exists is going to give you other kinds of knowledge. So what Descartes does is make an indirect kind of move to figure out what this foundation can be. And he makes this move at the start of the third meditation. So he recalls that he's certain that he is a thinking thing, and then he asks, but do I not therefore also know what is required for me to be certain of anything? Notice the question there, what is required for me to be certain? What makes me certain that I exist? What makes me certain that I am a thinking thing? Is there something about this knowledge, some property about this knowledge that gives me the certainty? And Descartes goes on to answer this by saying, quote, in this first instance of knowledge, there is nothing but a certain clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. So that's the key phrase, clear and distinct perception. I clearly and distinctly perceive that I exist. I clearly and distinctly perceive that I am a thinking thing, and that's what makes me certain, is having a clear and distinct perception. And if that's correct, if it's the case that clear and distinct perception is what tells you that you exist and you're a thinking thing, then it seems like we can find something to use to find other kinds of knowledge. And that's what Descartes says in this last passage. And thus I now seem able to posit as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true. So it's a general rule insofar as it can be applied to any possible source of knowledge. And if you have clear and distinct perception of something, you know it is true. You know it with 100% certainty. So if you have clear and distinct perception, for example, of 5 plus 7 equals 12, then it can no longer be doubted that 5 plus 7 equals 12. Notice one key word here. It's the word seem. Descartes uses that word because this general rule hasn't yet been fully established. Perhaps there's reasons to doubt this general rule. We need to be assured that it's going to give us the truth. So what Descartes is doing here is suggesting that this is the first principle that we should use to acquire other knowledge, the first principle that serves as the foundation for the sciences. He's suggesting that this is it, but he is indicating that he needs to give further proof of it, and that's what he'll do in the remainder of this meditation. But one quick note before we move on, you probably are asking yourself, what exactly is clear and distinct perception? Unfortunately, in the meditations, Descartes doesn't really tell us, and that's quite frustrating. But based on other writings of Descartes, clear and distinct perception is kind of like the following. If you clearly perceive something, you perceive with certainty that it exists. So it's an awareness of something's existence, an infallible awareness of something's existence. So that would be the statement, I am, I exist, or I think, therefore I am. And distinctness is an awareness or perception of the features of a thing, of a thing's properties. So that would apply to the thought that one is a thinking thing, that one's existence is as a thinking thing. So the questions are, is clear and distinct perception a reliable guide to truth? And likewise, what do we in fact have clear and distinct perception of? As I said before, this rule of clarity and distinctness is something that seems to be reliable, but Descartes notes that sometimes things that seem to be reliable, that seem to be certain, are later discovered to be doubtful, he says. And so what he does then is say what will show that it is in fact reliable. And what that will be is determining whether there is a God and whether or not he can be a deceiver. The idea here is that if God exists, and if sort of the traditional understanding of God is true, the traditional Western understanding that God is a perfect being that is all good, all knowing, and all powerful, then he wouldn't allow something to exist like the evil genius. His goodness would make him such that he wouldn't create an evil genius. And so there is no evil genius then to deceive us about very important matters. And so if he can prove that God exists, then he can prove that clarity and distinctness, something that we cannot help but rely on, is something that we're not deceived about. So that's what he's going to do in the rest of the third meditation, is try to prove that God exists. And God will be what has been called an epistemological guarantor, someone that guarantees that we have knowledge. I'll conclude this lecture by giving a rough outline of Descartes' argument, and the next lecture will give the details. So basically the argument works as follows. The first premise is that I have an idea of God, an idea of an infinite being, of a perfect substance. So I have this idea. So far, maybe this idea doesn't correspond to reality. Maybe I'm just wrong about there being a God. Maybe I'm agnostic. I just have the idea of God. The second premise is the crucial one. Only God, according to Descartes, could have produced this idea and put it in me. God is the source of this idea. And if God is required for me to have the idea in the first place, God has to exist. So that's, I think, a very original argument with Descartes, but we really need to examine it step by step, and that's what we'll do in the next lecture.